are gathered, so we're prepared to get started, and I'm sure a few others will probably join. Good to see everybody again. Mo Wright with Rayma for meeting number 6 of the Civilian Review Board work group. Thank you for hanging in there and getting us all to this place. I'll talk a little bit about what we plan to hope to accomplish today, and then we'll get a quick recap of where our last meeting was. But today is really about hearing from you around final recommendations. So along the way, we've been getting a lot of good feedback from you. We've been taking your sense of what you believe you would like the CRB to look like in Columbus. And so we do need to start moving that toward consensus, as this is pretty much our final meeting that we schedule, and we'll see where we are at the end. And then there may be an opportunity to come back together for some additional work in the future. But so today is really about kind of putting some points on some of the things that we've left kind of open, and also getting your final perspectives on a few pointed items that we'll get into during the course of the meeting. So here's basically our agenda that was sitting in advance to you, but after just some quick reminders, we'll do a quick recap of meeting 5, and then I'll kind of level set where I believe the group is as it relates to the current recommendations around both the CRB and the Inspector General. After that, we'll move into some facilitated discussions around 3 particular points: the composition of the board. We'll deal with things like appointments, term limits, meeting schedule for the board that is to be seated next year, as well as the job qualifications of the Inspector General. And at that point, we should be pretty much at the end of our agenda today, and we'll leave some time at the end for any closing questions or comments. So any questions from the work group before we get started, or any opening thoughts or comments? All righty. Brandon, you with us? You want to give us a recap of meeting 5?
Yeah, for sure. So we started off meeting 5, again, with just the basic initial introductions and reminders for the work group. Following that, we had a recap of the discussion points and topics from meeting 4 done by myself. This included a recap of the foundational overview, decisions, and points that still needed clarity from work group members, and an overview around collective bargaining. Following that, we had Jenny Edwards with Baker Hostiller gave a robust overview about that collective bargaining process. This included information around conciliation processes, examples of previous negotiation processes, and negotiable powers. She also went over some questions that members had from the previous meeting that were not answered. After that, we had a facilitated discussion around elements that needed to be prioritized within the public safety budget, as well as any remaining questions that members had around bargaining processes. And then after that, we closed out with Matt from the city with just closing remarks and details about the following meeting.
All right. Thank you, Brandon, for that. He is our note taker and make sure all of our deliberations are captured properly. So thank you for that. All right. So where we are, we wanted to obviously remind you we are in an open meeting. We're going to ask that you refrain. I think you all know this by now, but refrain from using the chat feature just for the sake of keeping everything in the public. I, as a part of this, just recall you are part of a public deliberating body at this point. And so comments and questions are recorded for that purpose and will be available for replay. I did want to remind you of those things. With that said, I want to jump into where I believe we are at this point as it relates to what you've said to us, and allow you to make any comments there or make sure we are on the same page relative to where we believe we are in the process. I'll start here with a review of the powers and roles of both the CRB and the Inspector General. And so we've gone through this in a number of different ways. Over the last several months, Baker has been giving you some insight about what other folks and other communities are doing around the country. And then we've been taking you through a series of conversations about what we'd like to see for the Columbus Civilian Review Board and related entities. And so here, when we deal with the powers, you recall there were basically 4 major functions that civilian review boards could actually exercise. And the probably most important and the most powerful of those would be the investigative function. And based on the feedback from this group, you've said to us that you would like to see the CRB be involved in investigations, to be able to eventually conduct its own investigation with a focus on use of force violations and any misconduct by the police that is discriminatory in nature. So that would be kind of an all-encompassing role for the investigative powers of the CRB that is to be seated. In addition to that, there is a review function. And so what you've said to us is you'd like the Inspector General to also have the power to review the fairness of internal Affairs Bureau investigations within the CPD, and then to recommend changes to policies and procedures. So as a part of the work of the CRB via the Inspector General, you said to us that in addition to looking at use of force violations and misconduct, you would also like a role to be that we are consistently reviewing decisions made within the department in their own internal investigations and making appropriate policy and procedure recommendations to the appropriate bodies at that point, which in most cases would be the chief and the safety director. That leads us to the third power here, and this was consistent with the charter amendment. The Civilian Review Board would recommend discipline to the chief and safety director, who would retain the ultimate authority. We had a number of other discussions about wanting to have direct influence over that decision and the ability to actually administer discipline. We know that's a very rare finding, and in this case, because the charter members spoke directly to the process of recommending discipline to the chief and safety director, we have to keep the powers of the group consistent with the charter amendment. That is not to say that through negotiation with the contract and the evolution of the CRB over time, then those things might not be readdressed at an appropriate time frame. But at this point, to be consistent with the charter amendment, it would be recommending discipline to the appropriate chief or public safety director. And then finally, around the four main functions, there was the advisory role, and what you said to us was that the CRB should oversee implementation of the police division's policies and procedures, being able to recommend overall policy while the safety and the chief manage the day-to-day operations. So you would play an ongoing advisory role, looking at trend data, looking at where there might be potential challenges, and on an ongoing basis, formally making recommendations to both the safety director and chief about potential policy or procedure changes. Let me pause there before we get into more specific powers as well and get any reactions, comments, or questions around where we believe we are as we kind of shape the powers and roles of the CRB and Inspector General. Any initial thoughts or comments there? Okay. Moving on into additional powers that we talked about, the first one was the power to subpoena. The charter amendment does provide that the Civilian Review Board may request issuance of subpoenas with the approval of City Council or the City Attorney. And so that is spoken to in the charter amendment. Additional changes in the contract, we know, as well as in some cases state law, still may be needed to fully empower the CRB to really be able to compel witnesses and the production of documents. But there is a process where through the powers granted through the City Attorney and through City Council, the CRB might request issuance of subpoenas in tandem with those two entities until such time that the contract or state law allows for the direct compelling of that evidence to come before the CRB directly. Alexa, did I say that right?
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah, as far as the contract goes, officers have certain rights of when they can be interviewed and things like that. So if the CRB wants to have full power to request interviews when it wants, there may be some changes that would need to be made.
Right, right. You also spoke to us about the need to have the CRB engaged in ongoing relations with the community. So having non-law enforcement capacity to really get input from the community on a variety of subjects. And we saw that as a common function in other cities where the CRB also, in addition to their investigative and adjudicative powers, are also playing a role where they are listening to the community and bringing that feedback back to the appropriate body. And so that was a power that you wanted to reserve for our CRB as well. One that we talked about that could be used for more minor offenses. This might be an instance where there was a citizen complaint, the citizen's only looking for an apology from that particular officer. There are instances where mediation is a power of particular CRB boards around the country. And then depending on the other powers the CRB retains, this might also be a function that the Columbus CRB actually has as a part of its powers as well. But again, lower level offenses and discipline that could happen through mediation between the CRB, probably with an officer on the force, and the CRB playing that intermediary and mediation role was one that we also, I don't recall having strong feelings about, but it certainly was one that didn't seem like the group was opposed to at this point. And so that is still on the table for our own civilian review board. And these last two deal with kind of the both the reporting function, so having a review board who would at least annually, if not more frequently, disseminate information out to the community. That could be a summary of the kinds of complaints that are coming in. It might also be what the outcome of those particular cases were, what the outcomes of CRB investigations might look like, how many are ongoing, are there any trends around the kinds of complaints or the kinds of discipline we're seeing. All those kinds of reporting functions speak to something that you said was really important to ensure the transparency of the group to the broader community. And so that is one we are keeping as a CRB power here in Columbus. And then finally, you said the CRB should recommend changes to hiring and promotional policies within the division, as well as the procedures and practices along that. So again, not direct hiring influence, but the ability to be able to shape policies, procedures, and the practices around how members of our police force are actually hired and retained in the department. So that's a summary of what we think we've heard from you around the general powers and roles of the CRB and Inspector General. And before we get into any additional questions about some of the more specific things, any questions or any instances where you have a different perspective or you want to raise a different issue about any of the powers or duties I've articulated at this point? Okay. All right, so let's get into some of the specifics in terms of how the group would be both appointed and term limits and how the group would actually revitalize or turn itself over. First question I'd ask you to think about, and we've talked about this at several intervals, and so one to start some discussion around, at this point we are in an appointment scenario where the mayor and city council will be making appointments to the CRB. And so as a part of this, and I've talked to and briefed both entities in the last week or so, both the mayor and Council President Hardin, and in both instances, they are interested in what kinds of filters, what kinds of considerations do you want them to have as they think about naming folks, or in some cases, maybe reviewing applications for people for the CRB. What are the kinds of criteria you want to make sure are at the forefront of their minds as they make those recommendations and or appointments? So some things we might consider here might be the overall diversity of the group, or ensuring certain demographics are represented might be something that's important to you. Are there particular backgrounds you would want them to consider as a part of the group? Is there certain geographical kinds of considerations you want to see in order to be eligible to sit on the CRB? What are those things you want to bring forward to those leaders who will have to make some of the decisions around who eventually gets evaluated for a seat on the Civilian Review Board? Thoughts, ideas there about the appointment criteria?
Mo, I have a question. This is Fred. Typically, a lot of these boards are comprised in terms of a party representative. In other words, you have so many appointees that are Democrat. There are so many appointees that are Republican. That is certainly a thought I think is worth considering. But then that may not necessarily play its way out when you look at trying to provide a diversity as it relates to the other categories. So I'm just throwing that out as a thought. The other thing that would be a thought is to have individuals who represent the stakeholders in this discussion, and that would include certainly individuals from the community. I know there's been a lot of debate with respect to what extent law enforcement should be involved. I think that there is a role for law enforcement to be involved in this process. Now, whether or not they should be the active law enforcement or retired law enforcement, I think there may be a lot of wisdom as to why we would want someone who may be retired as opposed to someone who was still serving on a police force, because that brings in a whole nother entity. Then I know we had some prior discussion about individuals who themselves have had experiences with the police. And I think there's a certainly merit in that discussion, but then there's also the risk of how do you taper that so that this does not become a forum for personal grievances as opposed to addressing policy issues and some of the other practices that have resulted in the kinds of challenges that have brought about this committee. So those are my thoughts.
Now, I appreciate that, Fred, and so all of those are on the table. I guess another way to summarize this point is the current recommendation, even though we have talked about, and the second question I'll ask you in just a moment is about any exclusions, but at this point, the group has not said from a consensus perspective that there are any exclusionary factors. So if you are in the geography of our city at this point, unless this group says they recommend differently, you would be eligible to serve on the Civilian Review Board. Obviously, going through a vetting process, obviously, finally appointing those things. But at this point, there are no exclusionary factors. So if the group has those that you'd like to bring up for discussion, now would be the time to do that, because after today, we do expect to move forward with whatever the recommendations are around how to choose members, as well as any exclusionary factors to the administration formally will make that recommendation. So thanks, Fred, for your feedback. Others of you, in terms of considerations about the appointments, things that they need to consider in that process of who sits on the CRB.
Question. Are you saying that we've already decided that they must be a resident of the city of Columbus, or are you saying that's subject to question, subject to discussion?
It is one, and that's one. I kind of tease it here with geography. There are two schools of thought, but again, that is an open question. At this point, the assumption, I guess, would be that they are City of Columbus residents, and it is a mixed bag when it comes to our city boards and commissions. In a couple of instances, you have to be in the geography of Columbus, or at least a Columbus taxpayer. In another instance, there are folks who will use the Franklin County border. And then there are a couple things where you can be outside of Franklin County, but still a Columbus resident. There's a couple things like that. So any of those considerations from this group, now is the time to bring them out. If you feel strongly they need to be Columbus residents, let's talk about that. If Franklin County is your kind of pool, talk about that as well. But yes, that is on the table, and it is appropriate to bring that forward now.
This is Aaron Saint.
If I may respond, it seems to me that part of the issue is that certainly the citizens of Columbus, when you talk about a Columbus police force, are the stakeholders in this whole issue. Now, do we, and I don't know that we necessarily do not have access to the kinds of talents and resources by restricting ourselves geographically to Columbus residents. I guess the flip side of that would be if there were representatives from however that may be defined that may fall outside of the city of Columbus, But I would just have a difficult time if somebody, say from Upper Arlington, is sitting on a review board involving complaints of a Columbus citizen. But theoretically, I guess the other side of that is that you certainly have folks who are in Franklin County who will be subject to the impact of police practices, even though they may live outside of the city limits. So to sum it up, I think at a minimum, there has to be at least a majority of those who make up this committee.
Yeah, and there are a couple of instances where it's live or work in Columbus, so that is a possible consideration if you if the group so thought it. I believe. Aaron, I think I saw you trying to get in there. Go ahead.
Yeah, so a couple thoughts. First, about a partisan consideration, I would strongly recommend that these are nonpartisan positions, that doesn't really come into play. And I think the biggest consideration for me is would like them to be City of Columbus residents that serve on this board. I think there's a lot of talent within the City of Columbus to draw from. And I do think that the community's been asking for, and the mandate from the charter is really about Columbus civilian review over the police department. So I think it does need to be those folks that live here locally. As far as then other things for consideration, I think going back to some of our conversations, we seem to agree that we wanted diversity of, race, sexual orientation, religion, income levels. So kind of trying to get a broad swath of the folks that make up Columbus as much as possible. So without getting too granular into that, I think taking that a broad look at different aspects of diversity and trying to ensure that that's part of the board.
Thank you, Aaron.
Mo?
Other thoughts? Go ahead.
Oh, I just wanted to interject really quickly, too, that the charter amendment that did pass, while it does not require you to be a resident of the city, it does require that the members shall be representative of the diverse communities within the City of Columbus. So if we were to consider some individuals who are not city residents, it doesn't preclude that, but you'd have to make some sort of a demonstration that they were somehow representative of the city's communities.
Mm-hmm. And Laura, is it fair to say that with other boards and commissions, we've made that standard? The work in Columbus has been the demonstration of that?
There have been other area commissions, and there have been other boards that the city has had where they've had to show a nexus to the board that they're serving. For instance, if they were serving on the Victorian Village board, you could either be a resident of Victorian Village or you could have a business that operates within Victorian Village. So there had to be some sort of a connection. And since this language in the charter doesn't require residency, you would need to be thinking around something along those lines of how are you going to demonstrate, if they're not a resident, that they are nonetheless representative of the various communities.
That's great. Thank you for that.
Yep.
So I'm going to state the contrary view that was suggested earlier. I think that there are a great many people who work in Columbus, who do not live in Columbus, who are substantially and significantly impacted by these matters. And I would be fine with something that said there should be a majority, maybe even a supermajority of Columbus residents. But I think to say that we are not going to permit participation by people who work in the city and maybe a very substantial portion of the people impacted by policing activity, I think would be unfortunate.
Yeah, I would just add, I think right now you don't even have a requirement for Columbus Police Department officers to be living in the city of Columbus. So I don't think you need a requirement for the members of the Civilian Review Board to be living in the city of Columbus. Obviously, having some nexus, living or working within the city, I think is important. But I also think that's a, determination that those can make in terms of appointing these members. I think it is something that we want to make sure it's reflective of the Columbus community, but I don't think we should put any sort of residency requirements on it. I think that should be a goal, but I don't think there's necessarily the need to put a requirement there.
And this is Jonathan. I would agree with Kent and Kyle that a Columbus taxpayer should be able to be eligible, although maybe you only say 1 or 2 slots would be, so that the majority are Columbus residents. The other thing, as far as the makeup, is I think if we're going to go with making certain slots for certain qualifications, we should probably consider having at least one individual that has retired law enforcement background, just so they bring that perspective to the group. That's not a majority by any standpoint, but at least it would give, if there were private deliberations, for instance, that they have that sort of perspective on things, because it is a very unique profession. And then on the exclusion question, I think in order to maintain the credibility of the board, we really need to think about having felony convictions as an exclusion for people that would sit on this board. And maybe you want to have a time limit to that, because I recognize the fact that the criminal justice system has victimized segments of our population. I understand that. But I think that it's important to think about the credibility of the board going forward.
Okay. So, you raised a couple different issues. I want to go ahead and unpack, but go ahead. I'll get to the next comment, and then I'll kind of recap those. Go ahead.
Okay. This is Bo Chilton. I agree with let's not be restrictive in terms of geography. I would think Franklin County at the very minimum. But I am curious. I want to make sure that we are meeting our diversity goals. And of course, you want to balance that with professional expertise. Did we settle on a number? I think we said somewhere between 7 and 11. So I was curious about that. And then I do want to have a deeper conversation on factors that would exclude residents. So I do want to dive into that a little more.
Noted. We're going to come back to the exclusionary piece right now, Bo, in terms of what we've shared with the administration and council. The working number, at least for the initial board, is 7. Now, keeping in mind, one of the other questions we'll deal with in just a moment will be these ex officio seats, which right now we've had as 2. So technically 9, but 7 voting members at this point is the number we are working with at this point. Couple things got raised in the last conversation. I want to make sure. So let me ask it this way. I've heard many of you say we don't want to be exclusionary in terms of the geography. We know the charter amendment speaks to needing to have a focus on Columbus at least, with some other connection point to Columbus that is compelling, I guess is the way I would say it. And so with the group as a recommendation, be okay with a majority, as your recommendation, the majority of the members that are seated be of the Columbus community. Is that a fair statement to represent your interest, not excluding the options of other folks outside of Columbus, but also ensuring that the core city remains the most represented on the board? Is that a fair comment, or do you, in line with what the charter amendment already says, is that a way we could get your consensus around that point at least?
Well, was that a majority of residents?
Yes.
Okay.
I could live with that.
Mel, this NAACP, we certainly can. I would rather, NAACP would rather that they be residents of Columbus, but we can yield and have a majority of those individuals from Columbus.
Any objections to that as a group recommendation, that the majority of the appointed members be residents of the city of Columbus? Any objections to that?
I would say I think that's fine. I just have questions around like the legality of some of that, just in terms of those requirements. I'm not sure how that works with the city.
I think what I heard Laura say is the way the charter amendment was initially written, it favored certainly residents of Columbus, but did not require it. Laura, you want to jump in there in terms of how we would interpret that from a city perspective?
That's correct. The charter amendment indicates that they have to be representative, but does not require residency. There's a secondary question that comes up from time to time as to whether or not you can compel employees to be residents of the city that they are working for. But here, and that's going to be the question, if this is an appointed position, then you have a little bit more flexibility because you're not actually employees of the city. You're appointed to a board. So again, it's going to kind of go into how we intend on having these individuals. Are they going to be employed? Are they going to be voluntary appointments? Or, how's that going to work?
And we have vetted that they will be volunteers. So that is, has been discussed with the leadership, and that's the preference at this point.
Yeah. That will weigh into whether or not we get into employment issues or not, in terms of residency as being a requirement. But I don't think that you're going to have a difficulty with expressing a preference that, a majority of the board be residents because of the nature of the work that the board's going to be doing.
Sure. All right. So it also got raised around this issue of, one issue that got raised was retired law enforcement having a seat at the table. We had talked about this in a couple different ways. So the question for this group would be, generally speaking, I think some of you thought it's helpful to have maybe that perspective in the room. So there's a lot of ways to do that. Would you use a seat for that, or would you have law enforcement representation that meets along with the board the same way you have? So it's in essence another ex officio seat, but it's not a appointed board member in this case. First of all, I guess, do you believe that there needs to be law enforcement expertise of either those who are probably retired from some form of law enforcement at the table in some way? And if you do, in what capacity? As a seated one of the seven, or perhaps as a ex officio person there who provides expertise and advice along the way? Talk to me about law enforcement and their eligibility for the group.
Hey, Mo, it's Anthony. Can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
I'm not really sure that you need law enforcement on the board. I think in some capacity, the IG is going to have to work with the active law enforcement police officers, but I don't know that you need that presence on this board. I think having the IG kind of helps put things into perspective, and a adept and astute IG will be able to convey information to the board from a law enforcement perspective. I mean, they probably will have that experience or have somebody in the office that has that experience. I don't know that you need that on the board. I think that can create some issues with the community as well. So it's supposed to be independent, and I think it's good to kind of keep it independent.
Other thoughts?
I know this is a Fred. I don't know if the board loses its independence by having a law enforcement perspective. I mean, because you do have issues that can, in fact, be highly technical in as relates to how officers are trained or view certain situations. And you're talking about an oversight of an officer's conduct without having that law enforcement perspective, I think creates problems in terms of our ability to accurately assess what it is that we're reviewing. I don't think it means that we are bound by that perspective, but certainly it's kind of like being on a medical board. If I were on a medical review board, I would certainly want to know what a doctor has to say in regards to a particular situation, and the same would be true as it relates to law enforcement.
And I think the point that was being raised, Fred, the question then becomes, in what way is that affiliation happen? Do you have a law enforcement professional there for advice and counsel who, unbiased, does not come with a constituency, is there to provide kind of, that expertise? Or are we looking to say that we would reserve a seat for that role which is a little different, right? Which kind of carves out a seat that we wouldn't have in any other instance. So, like, how do you see perhaps using that person? Is it a seat, or is it just having that person in the room?
I think that need can be satisfied by either perspective, quite honestly, from an advisory capacity or as a member of the board. But I definitely think that we do need that presence.
Just to add to that as well, this is Ishmael. I think I would agree. I think having a former law enforcement officer in some capacity be involved and actually be a member directly, I think that would be useful. I think Wilson kind of mentioned there being kind of possibly an issue with the community, given that we're trying to be independent. I think it can also have a positive impact in the sense that when you have the perspective of a law enforcement officer on the board who's saying, what that officer did was wrong, and this is what I would have done, or this could have been done better. I think it could have a perspective that could actually have a positive spin for the community. But I think do we need an active law enforcement officer? I think that creates a lot more problems than it solves. But having someone who's retired, who no longer has any direct ties, but who has all that experience, all that input, that could be very useful.
Right. And I probably should have clarified that. I think the way it was originally stated, it was retired law enforcement. So that is the working assumption that I have here in terms of if this person were allowed. Any other thoughts about the presence of law enforcement as a part of the board?
Hey, Mo, can I just say something real quick? If you do the research on a lot of like Maryland's and the different places, their stipulations are that no law enforcement will be present on that board. And so, again, and I'm just throwing it out there, even if you're retired, most retirees still have a connection with the FOP and other organizations. And Mayor Ginther's not always going to be here. So you have to be careful who gets that seat, because there's still some alliances out there with the FOP and other entities. So I just want to throw that out there because I'm looking way down the road too.
So
this is Jonathan. I think, Anthony, you bring up a really valid point. I feel like if we could go either way, it might be good as a way to sort of bridge the gap with the FOP to some degree, to make sure that we have at least that one vote at the table. But that's my only thing.
I want to say, I don't think you should require having a former law enforcement on the board. I mean, if that's something that ultimately is a decision that's made in the process, in the appointment process, then maybe that's a thing. But I don't think you should make it a requirement. I don't think that's necessary. I think what's important in the context of the Civilian Review Board here is really the balance in building community trust. I mean, at the end of the day, it's not as if, at least the one that we are developing or talking about right now, has the ability to implement discipline actions. I mean, we're talking about recommending disciplinary actions. We can talk about, in theory, the idea that you would put on a former law enforcement member so that you could build some credibility, perhaps with the FOP and others. However, that works in theory. It's not necessary that that's going to work in practice. And so, I don't think it's important or necessary to require it. I think if you want to have it, that's okay, but it doesn't need to be a requirement. There are going to be other avenues that could be done to undermine the broader board. And I think it's important, in order to build community trust, that we are focused on community representation. And when you put a member of former law enforcement on the board, there's power dynamics at play that can shift the balance of any sort of recommendations that a board decides moving forward. So I just think it's important for us to think about. I understand the desire to have that requirement. I just don't think it needs to be a requirement.
So you ready, Janae? Were you trying to get in there?
Yeah, I was actually going to say very similar to what Kyle just said. Is I don't like the idea of a requirement. I think we're then narrowing even further the pool of folks that will ultimately be seated on the board. I like the idea of keeping it in mind as a quality we might be looking for, or some expertise we might be looking for. Maybe there's a place for an advisory role, or even just thinking about when we're training the folks who are going to sit on the board, is there a way to give them the level of expertise, right? You're not going to get the actual doing of the job, but is there certain training that you can provide these folks to give them some better insight as to processes and procedures that are ultimately in place at the Columbus Police? I don't know if that's a solution. I don't think it gets to everything, but I think there's other ways we can arrive at the same goal.
No, I think that's good. So what I'm hearing is that maybe we just moved into the exclusion conversation. That's really when you turn on its head what we're talking about. I think what I'm hearing is while we are saying that there is probably some value into having a law enforcement perspective in the room and at the table, I don't hear us saying strongly it is a requirement yet. And so I think what I'm really hearing is we would not actively exclude former members of law enforcement from applying to be appointed to the board. Is that a fair statement on behalf of the group? We are not excluding that group from stepping forward, going through the same appointment rigor that anybody else would in order to be appointed. Is that a fair recommendation, that we would not exclude law enforcement, but we are also not requiring there to be a seat? React to that.
Here, one additional strain in the conversation, which was the possibility of a mandated non-voting or ex officio member. And that was at least part of the conversation.
Yeah, true. Yeah, I raised it that way. I think what we have heard, and Alexa, you maybe have some thoughts here in terms of how the boards actively work. How are they getting that law enforcement perspective in the room, I guess is the question I would ask you.
So usually, I would say most boards will not allow them to be voting members, at least for a certain period of time. For example, if you've been in law enforcement in the past 5 or 10 years. But if there is a role, it's usually advisory in nature.
So they're in the room, probably employed by Inspector General or CRB, but not representing that community. They're there for expertise and advice, those kind of things. All right. So any objections to the recommendation being that we are not actively excluding former members of law enforcement from eligibility to the CRB? Any objections to that? Okay. Bo, you wanted to come back to some of the other exclusionary factors. The second part of this was any factors that the mayor or city council should use to exclude residents from serving on the CRB. One that got raised earlier was the felony conviction. This has been argued both ways in the course of our meeting. We do need to make some decisions around it. I'll yield to you first, Bo.
Yeah, I'm definitely in favor of us having some criteria by which we would judge, but I don't want to automatically assume that someone who has a felony conviction could not be a good member of this board. Certainly as an organization that represents people, we believe in second chances. We've had some of our most dedicated, passionate people come through our program and serve our community well. So I would not want to make that an automatic exclusion. Perhaps for certain types of crimes, if we feel that that may be necessary, that's worth consideration. But I don't want to make that assumption out of pocket. So I just want to have a deeper conversation about who we're excluding, and is that the only people that or class of people that we're looking to exclude?
So,
yeah, I would just add.
Well, I agree with that.
Ahead,
we had a restored citizen on the safety commission. That perspective was incredibly important and insightful to have. I would expect that this board would have a similar experience. So if there is an excluding factor about how long it's been or a type of crime, that's something, but I think an across the board exclusion would be detrimental.
I would just add in, I don't think we need an exclusion at all on that front. I think that would be detrimental. If throughout the appointment process, obviously they go through all the various background checks or whatever with any sort of appointment process that happens. but I don't think we should make that an exclusion. I think that is deeply problematic in many ways. So I think that is something that through the appointment process we'll navigate around. I don't think it should be up to us to exclude anybody because of a felony conviction.
Okay. Other thoughts about, at this point, majority residents of Columbus, with some exceptions for having an interest in Columbus and being outside of the city, at this point, you're eligible. That includes City of Columbus employees. That would include law enforcement. It does not exclude them. Does not mean they'll be appointed, but it does not exclude them. The question is, are there any factors you would see that would exclude a resident locally from serving on the CRB? Any additional thoughts around that question?
If I could weigh in on this, I certainly understand the comments that are being made, and maybe one additional factor might be, in terms of someone with a felony conviction, is whether or not that person is currently under any type of court supervision. Probation, parole, post-release control, supervised release. I also think that there is some merit in considering the nature of the conviction, because I do think you run the risk of losing credibility. Let's say, for example, if you have a serial rapist on the committee, or you have someone who is involved in the brutal homicide of a child. I mean, there has to be some factors, and I'm not quite sure what the parameters would be, or what parameters this committee would be comfortable with. But I do think that there is some thought to weighing the nature of the conviction, status of the individual as we speak.
Okay.
And I would agree. I mean, we need to have some sort of parameters, even if we tell the appointing authority to take that into consideration. I would remind everybody that the bar is pretty high in terms of how we select police officers in this regard. So we just have to think about that, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think a credibility issue, I mean, we're talking about a mayor, city council involved in the process, and you would imagine that this appointment process will go through a whole background check and all the necessary pieces that you do there. So I do think there is a vetting process along the way. I worry that, you know, us as a board kind of setting forth exclusionary factors without knowing all the details behind a particular situation is problematic, and that at least our value should be of inclusion, right? And openness, and leaving it up to kind of the appointing authorities on those types of exclusions that they want to make. And so that's just where I stand. I mean, the city hires or appoints people to boards all the time, and I know and understand the nuances of this particular board. However, the notion that we're worried about credibility, I think ignores all the other actors that are playing a role in the appointment process.
Well,
that's a fair point, Kyle.
Maybe a way to
go ahead, Bo. Or
perhaps a way to address is to say that the fact that someone has a felony conviction is not an automatic exclusion. And then it's up to the appointing authority to weigh be appropriate.
Fred, I'm getting a really bad connection from you. I think what I heard you say though was maybe it's not an automatic exclusion. Is that what I heard you say? That a felony conviction would not be an automatic exclusion?
Yes,
okay.
Yeah, that a felony conviction or that a criminal conviction in general would not be an automatic exclusion, but that it is a factor that the appointing authorities may consider in deciding who to appoint.
Yes. That said, based on that, as well as what Kyle said earlier, are there any objections to recommending that there be a full background check of any CRB appointee? Any challenges with that as the group's recommendation? Which is kind of baking in what Kyle was saying, it would come out in the wash and then trust your leadership in some ways. But are we okay? We're okay with that as a recommendation, that we're not excluding anybody based on background, but they would have to submit to a background check, is what we're saying.
Yeah,
Makes sense.
Okay.
And are we suggesting that's more than what others would go through for other appointments? I just don't know what background checks others undergo.
Yeah, I'm with you. I don't think we should add more than what the city does through similar types of processes. I do want to be clear about that. And so I don't know if there's any thoughts on guidance on what the city does through these types of, whether it's a minimal type of check or, what do folks do, or what does the city do?
So this is Laura.
I'll yield to our city folks. Go ahead, Laura.
So what I was going to say, it largely depends upon the specific department and the specific position. So you're correct that, positions like law enforcement officers, positions that require you to have access to leads, databases, what have you, have more extensive background check requirements than other positions might. Positions that require you to drive have, different background check requirements than other positions might. I don't know that it could be said that there is an across the board that every position gets the same level or extent of background check. I think it really is position dependent. I know Kate wants to also weigh on that as well.
I would just second what Laura said. And I know that there's some, this civilian review board is all new, and I think that there's going to be some, really heavy thought put into how this is handled. So I think that the way we figure out how we're going to seat people is really important. But there is no across the board way we seat in any given appointment.
And to that point, which I think ties into the broader appointment process. I know we talked about the mayor and the city council making member appointments, and I don't know if this is where I make the addition, but I think we should consider opening that up beyond just the mayor and city council making appointments. So whether you have certain representatives, obviously other civilian review boards have, whether it's an ACLU or NAACP or an urban league or a bar association, or even a neighborhood or civic association appointing certain members as well. I do think there's important for us to think about that as well when we think about the appointment process, about who appoints, because otherwise you don't necessarily have the same independence from the mayor and the city council, which we know that in Chicago, prior to their changing of structures, when they were connected, really tied to the mayor's office, it didn't have as much independence. It was difficult for them to fully be an independent body. So I do think, as we think through the appointment process itself, that we should consider going beyond just the mayor and the city council being part of the appointment process.
I think that's important, Kyle. And I think some of the things that we've talked about is, we're really going to be looking towards our area commissions and outside groups to, push names forward, A. And B, we were talking about, for our police and fire candidates, we have what are called the COPE and phone boards, which are community evaluators that help to seat them in classes. And we interview these evaluators, and we're thinking that might be a good way to, I use the word hire, but to seat people on the civilian review board is to get community evaluators when we're going through the seating process. So it's not necessarily going to be just, who the mayor and city council, pick. it's going to be, kind of a overall who's best for the job.
And Kyle, that's a good segue. That's the next slide is around the appointment and the questions you're raising now. Let me, I want to go there next. Any other exclusionary factors you'd like considered though before we move? Okay. All right. So going to the segue Kyle just gave us, which is around the appointment process, the working assumption has been, after some discussion, that some hybrid of mayor and city council recommendations would get you to a group of recommendations. So the question becomes, how do those initial recommendations get even to those two entities? And there's a number of schools of thought, and there's probably a number of other options that are not listed here, which we're very open to, right? So the first is, if the ultimate decision will be made by council, do some of those or all of those need to bubble up through the area commission or civic association network? So that's something to think about. Are there community advocates or organizations or individuals like that who you want to make sure get consulted, who advise on particular appointments in the process? Is another way to think about it. Or is it just open? Is it you express an interest, you have an interest, you put an application forward? Doesn't mean you can't have, to Kate's point, the community screener role would kick in at that point, but is it an open application process? So in terms of, Kyle, I'll based on your comment, what other actors do you all want to make sure are part of the process? Before we go into that, I will say here, because she's not on the call, Jasmine, who's a part of the work group, was very articulate here about wanting elections. We've thought about that. It is very atypical to have that. Part of the reason why we're not sending that forward as a recommendation after some conversations is that it probably politicizes the people. I mean, in essence, what you'd be talking about is having candidates the same way you have a candidate for council or the mayor on the ballot, you would have candidates for the CRB, meaning they have to raise money. They've got FEC filings. They've got everything a candidate would have to do in our city. And so we don't do that for any other boards or commissions. Certainly noted her comments around this being fundamentally different, and we need to maintain the community trust. I wanted you to understand that that has not been presented here as the path forward, and I also want to acknowledge her comment and wanting that to be the case. That said, in terms of where we are right now, in terms of this appointment from mayor city council process, how should that flow happen? Are there additional actors you'd like to see represented in that process?
Well, can I ask just a technical legal question? Is
Absolutely.
it established in the charter amendment that has been adopted that the appointments shall be made by the mayor with confirmation by council, or is that an open question?
Laura, I'll come to you. I think I know the answer, but go ahead. Laura, are you there?
I'm here. I'm sorry. I'm having all kinds of technical issues. The answer is that was not established. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Can you hear me? Oh, sorry. The answer is that was not established within the charter amendment. That is something that going forward will need a decision that will need to be made. It's not in the charter amendment.
I mean, I think just as an add-on, I mean, I don't think it should be a given that they're appointed by the mayor and approval by city council. I mean, I think maybe the majority of members are or something like that, but I don't think it should necessarily be a given. I think you have a real opportunity for independence with a citizen review board or civilian review board when there are other appointing entities. I don't know what that looks like, right? What those other entities would be necessarily, but I do think there is some real opportunities for independence there that I think we should consider.
Kyle, did you say, this is Nana, did you say earlier that you thought that the individuals might be selected or recommended by community groups to present for appointments? Did you say that, or were you alluding to that?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So Yeah, the idea would be that, a certain number of members are appointed by the mayor and city council, and then you also have a certain number of members that are appointed by an urban league or an NAACP or an ACLU, right? Or a civic association or area commission, that doesn't need the approval necessarily of the mayor and the city council. I think that's worthy of discussion.
I do like that.
Okay. So let's talk about that then. So if there were other appointing bodies that played out, let's play the process out. Let's say it was the NAACP, to use the example.
That's a good one.
Then is that person absolute? Is that person, because the other piece is the second bullet I have here is around, we have elevated, and there seems to be not any objections to 2 additional members of the board that are bubbling up from some other community-based organizations. And so also keep that in mind too, that even if that was a way that we captured your earlier feedback from the group, that there would be 2 ex officio members, we still have to figure out where those folks come from. Is that application open? Is it bubbling up from certain organizations or some other process? But we do want those 2 to work in tandem. So what you're talking about in essence is a 9-person board, 7-person voting, with representations from the community, ideally everywhere, but certainly from the 2 additional members of the board. Talk to me about how you see those interplaying. And Kyle, to your question about additional appointing bodies, who does that look like if it's not mayor and city council? And that's
So I'll jump in first on this. So in this particular instance, I think if you do have, if you have a model where other entities appoint someone without the approval of the mayor or city council, then that particular model might not need an ex officio model. And instead you have consistent slots that are made where it says, there's a certain amount that are going to be appointed by the mayor, a certain amount by city council, and a certain amount by these designated community-based orgs. And everybody's a voting member, and that's consistent. I know civilian review boards do that. I think Atlanta does something like that where they have a variety of different appointing bodies. And so everybody could be a voting member. Now, the ex officio non-voting members, you could play that out if you needed to in a particular instance. But I think you wouldn't necessarily need that if you change the model altogether and saying that it's not just the mayor or city council appointing members, and you have a agreed upon group, community organizations that have their appointments each time this comes up. I think that is worthy of consideration.
So, Kyle, Kate Shaddy, short of having a civilian review board of 25 members, where does this stop? Because we have to look at it from a holistic approach then from the city standpoint. And, all of a sudden we're going to have groups that we didn't know that would be interested in having representation and wanting to have representation.
Yeah, no, I mean, so obviously that's a tough question that I think would have to be negotiated, right? I mean, I think you historically it's like they're, without a doubt, when you're talking about these issues, an urban league and then NAACP would be involved, right? And then you think about a potential bar association, then you have maybe other interests that are there. But I think this could be done in a way that, like any sort of body, I mean, you could have 9 or 11 members and have that set. You could also have a model that's rotating, right? You could have a rotating model that says that a certain amount is going to be a certain organization or a set of organizations, and they kind of rotate out, but it serves a similar kind of base. I think that's something you could look at as well. This is obviously not easy to sketch out, but I do think it provides additional independence that you wouldn't necessarily have if the appointments always rely on the mayor or city council.
Can I just make one point? So on the data that Nicole has presented to us, every single case, every single example that they've given us, those members have all been appointed by the city manager, by the mayor, by city council. I just wanted to make sure I just wanted to note that point. And then Alexa, I don't know if you had any conversations with anybody. Have you run into any organizations that have tried to address this issue with places or organizations that were not mayor, council, city manager, anything like that?
I think Baltimore is one where certain community organizations have a seat that's designated each time around and do select. I think more commonly it involves city council or the mayor or city manager, but there are a few that have certain civic organizations that will select members.
Well, I just wanted to make the same kind of clarification I had before. On the slide we're looking at, it says there will be 2 ex officio non-voting members. I want to make sure that's not part of the charter, right? That's just sort of a proposal, as there would be.
Correct.
That
Okay.
is correct, Kent. That is Mo language, not charter language.
Okay, thank you.
Mo, if I could just step in, just kind of.
Go ahead.
Yeah, Mo. So just to add to I think the mayor, city council / organizations being involved, I think I would echo what I think one of the other members indicated as well, as far as, we're talking about a 7-person body. It's not 25, it's not 30. I think it would complicate things a whole lot more if we were to have these organizations having now veto power. They have to be able to pick someone to be on there. I think it would just complicate things a whole lot more. I think I'm assuming the mayor and city council would already be, consulting with different organizations, associations already. So that's already built in. I don't think the mayor or city council will just be making random calls. They'll be consulting with all these different community associations, NAACP, Bar Association, and all these different associations that are interested. But I think maybe having something where, we say, we would advise them to consult with these community partners. I think that's great, but I think to require them to have actual veto power, I think that would just, kind of complicate things a whole lot more.
Look, I'm happy to complicate it. Look, and I don't think it'll be that complicated. Here's the thing: at the end of the day, it's fundamentally about a power of a group and the independence of a group. If you have a civilian review board that the appointment process is made by the mayor and city council alone, then there is a certain amount of accountability there that is stuck with the mayor and the city council alone. And I think if you really want to build out independence, you have those other organizations that are there to play a role in this. And I don't think you need to have it to be 20 members necessarily to do that. But there's a big difference than consulting and being able to make the appointment yourself as an organization. And I think it's just something we should consider. I think it's also an opportunity to strengthen area commissions or civic associations. I mean, if you know that if your area commission or civic association has a spot every time on picking a member on the civilian review board, that's powerful, right? And so, same thing with strengthening our other civic organizations. If you know that I can be a part of this community organization and they have a spot on the civilian review board, that's also powerful. So I think, it's obviously difficult to choose which ones get there and which ones don't. But I do think it provides that independence that can make a big difference when it comes to these issues. And so I think we should consider it.
So Kyle, let me make sure I understand your recommendation. Just 1 second. I want to make sure I understand what Kyle's asking us for here. So in this case, mayor, city council, yes, having some role. In addition to that, other entities having the equivalent of those roles, right? So however they get to their name is automatically on the CRB. So I heard you say area commissions and civics. I also heard you say like your urban leagues, your NAACPs. And so, and this is without looking at the second piece of this, which is the ex officio piece. Who are we talking about here, right? Because civic associations and areas are more part of the city infrastructure. Others are separate entities. And I guess my question would be in part, couldn't you make the same argument that an NAACP, by virtue of who they are, has an agenda, right? An urban league has an agenda. It's probably the right agenda in many cases, but it's an agenda. Is that any different than having your city-wide elected leaders making those determinations. So I guess the question is, who are you actually advocating for having a say here? Because I got to be able to make this into a recommendation one way or another.
Yeah, I would say community-based organizations. I'm more in support of as having a voting, more so than just a non-voting, like having a voting a slot. I think the ex officio stuff comes in, the non-voting stuff comes in when when you talk about negotiations and what the city wants and what they don't want. But I think it's our job as a work group, right, to think through what are ways in which we can really build a strong, independent review board. And I think one way to do that is by having community-based organizations. Now, everybody's going to have their own agendas, of course, but I also think that the power is still going to rest with mayor and the city council, because in this group, you kind of determine who those organizations are and who they would pick. I think that's still a role you can play, but I do think it adds to the credibility component. It adds to the trust building component in a way that we wouldn't necessarily have if everything is done at the advice and consent of the mayor and the city council.
Other thoughts on this question about our comfort level with the appointments from mayor and city council, or wanting additional voices who have actual an appointment to the board? Let me hear from some others of you on perspectives on that either way.
This is Fred again. One of the things that we had talked about before, of course, was the area commissions, and I think when you got like 20 or so of those
25
groups that are out there. So if you give a vote, so if you give a vote to each one of them, you've got a 25 committee board. So maybe it might be having the commissions collectively have a vote. And then when you talk about having organizations within the community, you have as many different organizations as you have commissions. So how do you decide, and to the extent that you decide on one, that's automatically going to result in an exclusion of the other. So it might be wise to have some sort of a hybrid that recognizes the history of the area commissions, because they certainly would have an interest in terms of their community, and supplementing that with groups such as the NAACP, the Columbus Urban League, and I would even suggest groups like Impact.
Any other thoughts around this from others?
So at one point, I first want to say, like, the thing with the area commissions, how do you draw that line? Because you have 25 area commissions, you have magnitudes more of civic associations. So that, you need a process to manage that, or you have a board of hundreds here if every one of those groups gets to send someone of their choosing. So is there a different role with some of these groups in advisory, not an advisory capacity, but like submitting a short list of candidates or something like that as part of a selection process? But at one point we also discussed open applications, and I think this idea that anyone connected to the Columbus community should have an entry point to applying and being on this board, whether or not you're an active member of the particular groups that have selection criteria, or selection authority. So, I think that's something that I'm interested in preserving, is that we have a way for ordinary citizens to apply to be on this board.
Got it. So, Aaron, if I had to summarize that, it sounds like your preference would certainly be some form of open application, recognizing there will be due diligence, but that being the starting point.
I would prefer to have it at some point in this process, whether we have a hybrid selection, but I do think gathering any of those in our community that would submit themselves forward for this. And then, of course, we have all these interested parties that can play a role in the selection. But I don't want to be too limiting, because I guess what I feel like is happening is we're kind of picking a list of those are the people who put in, and does that end up excluding other people who want to be a part of this process? And I guess I don't have a real strong way. It's just a question to be asked before we settle somewhere.
All right, so let me dissect this a little bit. Let me start with the question of who will make appointments to the council, and then we'll talk about the process of them getting to that appointment. The working recommendation coming in was the mayor, city council. We've had additional comments around broadening that to other community-based organizations. First of all, in terms of who makes the appointments, regardless of how they get to those applications at this point, thoughts from others that we have not heard from around, is it mayor, city council? Should it be broader? And certainly city folks, if you have thoughts about why this will or can't work one way or another, certainly weigh in along the way. So I see Denzel, I see you on here. I see, I'm just calling people out now. Janae, feel free to jump in there. Jonathan, go ahead.
Oh, I have something to say. Okay, yeah. Because we are such a diverse community, we have area commissions, gobs of civic associations that feed into the area commissions. Then we have the county, the community advocates. What about those groups recommending individuals to serve on this board? And maybe that was said by Kyle, but in a different way. I'm just trying to envision how this is going to work. Can we just ask those groups to submit names to the mayor and council, or to someone else? That's a thought.
Okay. So there would be groups who get invited to recommend individuals into the process. And then to that point, if we kept this model where there were these two other seats, would that be the way to handle that, right? So would that be the way of saying there will definitely be representation from at least community-based organizations because they have a list that they populate?
Yes.
Is that the way to do it? Okay.
That's just my thought. I don't know. I like to keep things real simple, so I don't like to get into the weeds. You know how I am, Mo.
And hey, Mo, to Nana's and Aaron's points, particularly, about how we can create the most open process and have the consideration of the most number of people. I think that could be limited by having other organizations who actually make appointments. I think that limits the number of people that can be considered. I think that, to Nana's point, if you have a lot of organizations who make recommendations to the mayor and council, and then the mayor and council have those considerations, that this opens us up to the biggest and most diverse number of possibilities.
I mean, I think we could do all the above. I mean, I think you can have those organizations that, submit names and recommend names to the mayor or to anybody. I mean, they can recommend names to any of the appointing bodies, but, if I'm an NAACP and I had the choice between recommending a member or appointing a member, I think I would just appoint a member. I think I would rather have that. I don't know.
All right, folks, I need your pleasure one way or another.
But NAACP, it wouldn't matter. If it were the NAACP, it wouldn't matter as long as we were at the table, because we'll get in where we fit in.
There we go. Of course, Nana, you got it.
Kyle, tell me if I heard this wrong, but part of what you just said seemed like like collect them from everywhere, like multiple points of entry to consider candidates. Did I get that wrong, or am I making up a new process here to get these folks?
No, so what I'm saying is, like, obviously, I think what we have here in the top line makes sense. Like, if people, when you think about recommendations, like, you get your recommendations from a set of groups, and then you have an open application process, perhaps. But I also think that the only thing that I would change is this, appointments will be made from a hybrid of mayor/city council recommendation. Like, I think the actual appointing body should be more than just the mayor and the city council. I think if you had, an agreed upon set of community organizations to do that, I think they should be able to appoint. Now, look, I understand the context around this, and if you need to have additional independent oversight, you could have some, you ultimately get the advice and consent of the mayor or the council. That, I guess that's one thing you can do. But the reason why I say it's important that you have a consistent community-based organization that gets to a point rather than just recommend is because you could, like, sure, you can recommend something, but it doesn't mean that that's going to be taken upon. Now, obviously, we would hope that's the case, but it doesn't necessarily mean that our recommendations are going to go anywhere. Same thing with recommending disciplinary action. You can recommend that to the police chief and the safety director. It doesn't mean they're going to do anything about it. I think there's a lot more power in being able to directly make an appointment. And so something to consider. I mean, I think if that's too far for people, then we talk about these recommendations actually having some weight behind them. But I don't think it's out of the question necessarily for a certain designated community groups to be able to appoint a member to say, yeah, every year whenever this is up, we have somebody on the bar association, or we have somebody in the urban league, or somebody X, Y, and Z. I think that is something that is worth consideration.
How do we?
I think
groups like with this
go ahead, Aaron.
With this working group. So let's say if we've got 9 seats, we'll say 4 or 5 of those seats are kind of set aside for these other organizations, and maybe they're drawing from the pool of applicants and they're making recommendations that way, or however that works. But how would we select those groups, I guess, because that then becomes the next question, is if you assign other organizations to have a direct appointing authority, how do we pick those?
Yeah,
how do we make sure that's in line with the community and is fair?
Mo, I want to interject one other consideration as the group is having this conversation, and that is that the charter does require not just that it be the board not just be representative of the diverse communities, but also that it be representative on the basis of race, sex, sexual orientation, gender identity, expression, religion, disability, ethnicity, age, socioeconomic status, and geographic region. The reason I bring that up is that as you're considering how this would work, think about if you had one centralized group of individuals, you can assure that you meet all those cross sections. But if each individual entity instead appoints one person, how would we then assure that it had that across the board diversity of members on the board? I'm not saying it's exclusive, but I'm just saying about how that would work.
Yeah, I hear you. Keeping it together at least allows you to look across it and see the diversity of the group holistically. I agree. Okay. That said, we have heard some alternative to this. Is there an objection, noting Cal's comments as well as Jasmine, who kind of weighed in before the meeting, around this hybrid approach of mayor, city council? Are there any other objections to that being the appointing bodies? And then we'll get into applications themselves. Any other objections about that being the appointing authority?
Well, I just want to say one more thing that I think is in support of the notion that Kyle is advancing. And that is about independence. And Kyle mentioned this. But we are not always going to have the mayor we have now. We are not always going to have the city council that we have now. And I can see some real advantage to there being some portion of the appointing authorities that are not the mayor and city council.
Hey, Mo. And so are we fine to elevate the idea of there is at least a will of the group is that we need to find a way for other community-based organizations to have a significant influence into the appointing process? Is that a fair depiction of what we said? I don't think that I've heard a majority of you say that, but I do hear the notion that we don't necessarily want to assume that mayor and city council are the only voices that need to be heard. That has to be balanced with some of the comments that got made, which were, how do you choose the other organizations who would appoint, which would be another major conversation. But can we say to the administration, is the will of the group to have some significant influence wielded from other community-based organizations and a process in which to do that. Is that a compromise we can agree to?
I agree.
Yeah, I mean, I think
I would agree with that.
If that's the compromise, then I don't think you need the ex officio non-voting members. I think those people should be voting members. But look, I'm going to continue to push on this because I do think it matters. I understand the desire and for complexity reasons to have the mayor and the city council just make the appointments, and probably there might be just some of the legalities side of it. I'm not sure what the details are in terms of who actually appoints this. But I do think that, if we are going to have recommendations by certain groups or set of groups, that like at a certain point, we should get to the point that if they make a recommendation and let's say they just say, we've got one person or a set of people that we want, that person would be at the table, or that organization's interest would be at the table. I do think we really need to get at that. I think that helps get at some of what Jasmine was trying to discuss as far as elected members, for example. Now, you might not have people be elected. However, you can ensure more community representation in a way that you could not necessarily ensure if you don't have that independence from the mayor and the city council. So I just want to strongly suggest that. And so if that's through a recommendation that is more strongly weighted, then I guess that's the point. But I don't know what the options are. And I would just open the door to exploring more what an option would be if you said we had a set aside number of community organizations and they actually make the appointments. And then, maybe you needed a check or approval from the city council or whatever. But for the most part, that's a done deal. I think that's worthy of our approach moving forward.
I agree with Kyle.
Hey Mo, can I chime in for a second? It's Anthony.
Yeah. Uh-huh.
Hey, I just wanted to make sure that, and I'm sure everybody knows this, but we're talking about independent of the police department, not necessarily the city. And so I don't want to lose sight of that. And also, I don't want to go down open up Pandora's box, because when you allow one organization, there are going to be a lot of other organizations that are going to be wondering why they're not selected. So I just wanted to chime in and throw that out there.
Yeah, I think that's still the open question, Anthony, is even going to that model, if there's anybody other than folks who've been citywide elected, the question will be, is there bias, and does the bias rise to the level of protecting the community's interest in this effort? And I think that's a challenge with any organization, because it also could be, well, I won't name them, but there could be a lot of other organizations who feel like they need a seat that aren't the ones we named here. So also keep that in mind too. And they would have an equal argument in many ways. So I think what we're hearing though is the sentiment that independence is fundamentally important for the board, and that there has to be a path for community-based organizations and entities that are non-city to weigh significantly into the appointment process, and that your expectation is that the administration will allow and design and allow those pathways to exist in the appointment process, I think is what I'm hearing of the group. I also think I'm hearing, although we talked about these other ones, most of the comments that were made were around an open application process, meaning anybody who is a part of our criteria we just talked about previously is fair game, and that we are not looking at these other entities to do dedicated appointments. Am I hearing that right? Or is there thoughts that there are specific groups who would be consulted more than others about appointments? So are we talking open application, or are we talking any of the other ones I have listed here? Commission, civics, not that they would be excluded by any means, but they are not also not formal recommendations. Any objections?
I mean, yeah, I guess the question to this one just has to do with what we decide on the first half, right? So I think if you have designated, here's the thing: if you have designated community-based organizations here as ex officio non-voting members, you still run into the same problem you would if they were voting members, which is that you have to choose between a whole host of different organizations that would be designated. But I do think, if we get, this would be my secondary hope, right? Like if we can't get to a point where there are designated sets of community organizations where they have voting members consistently on the board, then at the very least, we need to make sure that there's some ex officio non-voting status where the community is there. But I think we can get to the point where you have voting members that are representative of a particular community. I understand that it's difficult to choose from all the various membership bodies that are out there, but I also think that other places have done it. I mean, it's possible for us to do. I don't necessarily know if it's up to this work group to decide who those organizations are necessarily, because we also are not representative of everyone. But I do think it's worthy for us to think about. That's kind of where I land on this. I don't. I know we're going to present these recommendations to the city, and so they're going to have options that they can choose from. Also, a lot of this is going to be subject to the contract negotiations that happen. So, I mean, I think if there's going to be give and takes, I think we should just make sure our recommendations are there, but we keep some options open too.
Okay, noted on all of that. So we'll continue to keep this one kind of open. We know where the current recommendation is. I've made a note of the spirit of what you are trying to accomplish, and we're expecting a process that will respect that. And so we're going to have some additional thinking about how we would vet those organizations that might have more of a significant voice in the process. But I have heard the members who would like that to be the case. So that those points are noted. In addition to that, in terms of board members and the term length, we pretty much established that there will need to be, in our previous discussion, an initial board. So the first question I would ask you to think about any preferences around how long that initial board sits. And so what that would mean is the mayor or whoever, it's mayor, city council, between now and the beginning of the year, let's say, would appoint an initial board to serve an initial 1 or 2 years. And we know there's a number of operational dynamics that need to be worked out. There's the hiring of an inspector general. There's a number of things that need to happen to stand up this initial CRB, and then that board would go away, and then the first full board would be appointed at that point, is our working philosophy. With that said, I guess the first fundamental question would be the initial board that would commit sometime in 2021. Do you see that initial board serving 1 or 2 years, probably not beyond that, before we seated the full board? Any strong feelings one way or another about the length of that initial board service?
Can I ask some questions? So this initial board, you're saying would just serve, like I said, this 1 or 2 years, and then they would all go away, but they're the ones who hired the inspector general? Is that correct? Am I from?
That was based on, and Laura can correct me if I'm wrong, I believe the charter speaks to the CRB hiring the inspector general. So I said that with that as my interpretation of that, but is that right, Laura, in terms of what the charter says?
Yes, that is correct. The Inspector General shall be appointed by a 2/3 vote of the Civilian Police Review Board and confirmed by the mayor. But there's no specific term set right now for how long the Inspector General would serve.
So then in the future, if the Inspector General's term was, say, just pulling something out simple, 5 years, then in 5 years, whatever, that permanent board would then go through the selection process and either retain or pick someone new. Is that correct?
That's something to be determined. So the charter doesn't require any specific term, nor does it require that there be a term. It just says that whatever process there is, that individual would be appointed by the Civilian Review Board.
And Aaron, we are going to deal with that specific question in just a moment in terms of, is that a contract? Are you hiring an inspector general for 5 years, or are you just codifying the criteria and that could serve until they are not serving anymore, right? So we are going to talk about your thoughts around that in a moment.
Mo, could you just say again, what was the rationale behind the idea to have an initial board that served a shorter period of time before full board rather than just starting with the appointment to the full board?
I think it's the foundational work, Kent, and that really came from the conversation we had in this group, but I think it was the idea that it's going to inevitably be, I mean, Laura can probably name 20 questions she has right now that I didn't bring all of them to you tonight, but just kind of the standing up of the board, the committee, the initial meeting cadence, flow, all those things that would be, I mean, certainly there could be a school of thought where you say, we just want, maybe the initial term is longer, and then you keep a board for longer would be another way to think about it. But the conversation you all had previously was seating the board to do the initial foundational work. Maybe those members, some of which get reappointed, that was an open question. But in either case, having that as a initial board to do initial work, and then the full board kind of being off and running to do the work of the CRB as it would probably be for just at least the foreseeable future.
And so the idea, it also emanated from, that's how area commissions get set up as well. So you'll have an initial commission that will be responsible for doing a lot of the mechanics of setting up the bylaws, the regulations, the terms of office, anything, or how the processes by which the board operates, and then basically getting it off the ground. And that's some of the area commission working groups then results in permanent area commissions, and that's kind of where the concept came from.
In those cases of the area commissions, you have an initial group who basically sets up the foundational aspects of the organization. And but do they have? Is there any continuity of leadership? Are they eligible for a second term, or do they all roll off and we start anew with a new board?
That's all still to be determined.
No, I'm asking, what is the model for the area commissions now? You use that as the example, and I was asking, what is the current process with a new area commission coming on?
Right, and what I'm saying is built into the city code, the allowance for that initial create bylaws, and sometimes bylaws will express how individuals who are part of that group can or cannot continue on in their seat, or steps going forward from there. So it's going to depend on the area commission and bylaws they adopt.
Gotcha.
So, Bo, do you have, I think I see where you're headed, but do you have a thought around that one way or another in terms of this idea of continuity? And we have not spoken to if they would be eligible or not. That's not a part of either way. So at this point, they would be eligible to be appointed to a full term. That would kind of start their 1 or 2 terms, depending on what you all decide, or not have a term limit.
For me personally, I think you're going to need 2 years to get all of this really nailed down. And I do think there could be some value in refreshing the board, but I do think you need a few members to continue to serve. You need that continuity of leadership. In terms of full board terms, I am in favor of term limits, so maybe 4 years, and they should certainly be staggered.
Heard both initial recommendations. Let's deal with the first one first. Any objections to 2-year initial board terms for those who will seat the board and set structure, policy, procedure for the department? Any objections to the 2-year time frame from any of the work group?
I don't object, but I don't think it's necessary. I just
start with the initial group.
I just start with the board, and yeah, their first work would be the work you're describing, but that would just be the first work they need to do as members of the board. I just think this adds a sort of layer of complication. I'm not sure accomplishes anything.
Yeah. So just to clarify, if I were to stick with this box, I would be in favor of 2 years. But really, I'm with Kent on this. Let's just get started with the board. Yeah.
I would just plus one to that. I mean, if there are circumstances where people only want to do a few years or whatever because they don't know what is to come, and that's a big commitment, then sure. But I think why not just start, and perhaps this is up to discretion in terms of the city or whatever, in terms of kind of staffing this board and kind of looking at what that looks like. I mean, there are going to be other questions too, like what happens when somebody decides to end their term or they move early, what do you do to replace that person, right? I think you might as well just start as a full term that we've made a decision on. If that's an issue, I don't know.
So if we do it that way, just from a matter of thinking about how that would be structured, and you also want staggered terms, then we're also going to have to make some of the decisions now, because if you're going to appoint the board as a board rather than have an initial board, then a lot of those decisions are going to need to be made now. So when they're appointed, they have the staggered terms.
So I can share, I've been part of several organizations that started a new organization with boards. And the way that we did it was we had a third come in at 1 year, we had a third come in at 2 years, and a third come in at 3 years. And then from there, we had the regular full board term. That way it's automatically built into staggering. And for those who may just want a short commitment, they can decide at the end of that 1 year or 2 year term if they want to renew or not. But that builds it in.
So I was actually going to echo or say something similar to Bo there is maybe we solve a couple of problems here by having, some of these initial terms might be shorter than the full 4 years that we might allot, or whatever the number is we decide. That solves the staggering problem at the outset. Also addresses the problem that Kyle pointed out, is that some people may not want to make a 4 year commitment at the outset. And we do it that way, as opposed to, I think, overcomplicating things a bit.
Noted. And so I think I'm hearing a movement to go direct to appointment, recognizing they'll need that almost moots the staggered question. There would be a staggered term. Any objections to not having an initial board period and moving right into a period of full terms that would be staggered with the appointment process that is to forthcome? Any objections to the elimination of this first question around how long the initial board term would be and going right into full term? Anyone not agree with that as a course of action? Okay. I'm going to come back to that one around the term length, but I want to deal with term limits first. Fundamentally, you can say yes or no, and if you can, sir, should there be a limit to the number of terms, regardless if they're 3 or 4 years, or longer or shorter, should there be a limit to the number of terms an individual can serve on the CRB? We had a little discussion about this. We kind of left this as an open question. Some of you like the idea of institutional memory, and if you can continue to add value, being able to stay as long as you want. Others thought there need to be turnover at some point, but not too short. I'm bringing that back tonight for decision. Thoughts around term limits, regardless of term, probably between 3 and 4 years would be the working assumption. Do you like the idea of having limits at all? And if so, what would be the appropriate level of terms one could serve? No thoughts?
Just jump in.
You're not coming back again.
Yeah,
Don't decide tonight.
I'll jump in here. I don't think you need to have total term limits necessarily, but I do think you should have consecutive term limit. Like, I don't know when we make a decision there, but like, I don't think you need somebody who's on there for 3 straight terms or something like that. But if they got out and then they came back years later, that's fine. That's just my thing. I do think there should be some sort of term.
Yeah. Other thoughts?
So to create a discussion point, I'll suggest 2 consecutive 3-year terms, just so we have something to work from.
That sounds great to me.
Sure. 2 consecutive. You said 3 years, Kent?
Yeah.
For sake of discussion? All right.
Yeah.
So the idea would be not limiting total number of terms, I think I'm hearing, but to limit any consecutive terms to 2. And that's going to put folks either, with our working assumption, on for 6 or 8 years, depending on where we land on that question. But at least 2 consecutive terms. Any objections to that as our working model? Sit off a term. Technically, you could come back for another time if you're a glutton for punishment, I guess. All right. 2 consecutive terms. I'm going to go back then to the number of years that make up a term. The options we're saying roughly is probably going to be, particularly considering this initial foundational period, we will need to stagger terms regardless. So I don't even know, are we okay with being a hybrid of 3 and 4 years, recognizing that some seats will be 3, some seats will be 4 in order to ensure the continuity? Can we keep those as our working 2 board length or term length? So I'm talking about 3 years or 4 years, staggered terms. Go ahead.
I think it's easier if you go with a full term of 4 years, and so you're staggering your initial start as, half of them are 2 years and half of them are 4 years.
I'm sorry, Aaron, you were a little choppy there. Can you say it again?
I think it's cleaner with your staggering if you pick the even number, so a 4-year term, and then staggering, appointing every 2 years, so you've got 2-year, 4-year.
Okay. All right. So I think I hear then 4 being our max term, and then staggering them down from there to get the diversity we need in terms of length of service, with 2 being the minimum. I thought that was what I heard.
Yeah, I mean, I think 2 or 4 year terms make sense, or the sweet spot would just be 3-year terms. I know, some people are not going to want to be on the board for 4 years. That's a long time. So, but that's what I'm thinking as far as kind of a timeline: 2 or 4, or if everybody had the same, doing 3-year terms, and then perhaps some people at the beginning roll off, so you have that staggered term.
Okay.
I guess one other way, and so this is a different kind of perspective on it for me then. If you're looking at 3 years, there probably is some value to making sure that long term you're staggered in such a way where you don't have more than 50% of the board coming up for, so you don't have a whole, half of a new board in 1 year.
Yeah.
For institutional knowledge. So if you went with 3 and you'd only potentially have a third each year coming up, so that would be one advantage there.
Got it. Okay.
So that idea might be that the initial people are appointed, some for 1 year, some for 2, some for 3, and then it all rolls from there. Everybody has a 3-year term after that.
Yeah, that's what I was advocating for initially. When we've started up boards that I've been a part of, we did 1, 2, and 3, and then had the consecutive terms come immediately after. And you have your natural stagger. And then depending on the bylaws, you either appoint someone to that unappointed term, or they go through that process to be vetted again when you need to fill a seat.
Yeah, that makes sense to me.
Okay. Got it. Almost the last thing's on our work. You got 10 more minutes to do this. All right. So once a member is seated on the board, these are some of the common reasons why one might be removed, and want to see if you are in objection to any that are there, and if you would need to add any that would be other reasons why you might remove someone. Just want to get a sense of the group around some of these. Once a member is seated on the CRB, under what circumstances can it be removed? Neglect of duty or failure to attend meetings, meaning they're just not showing up, they're not actively participating, you're not getting the value you're looking for. Some type of malfeasance in the role that they are in. Could even be Some conflict of interest or something like that might also arise here. Failure to complete mandatory training. This came up earlier and will probably be a factor where you will need a functional knowledge of some operational procedures of the department, probably. And so is that one that you might think about? And that also could probably go under A as well. Maybe they get a criminal conviction during this time. Maybe it has to be a felony. Does that matter to you one way or another? And are there other types of circumstances you would want to see someone removed for? Talk to me about any, once you are seated, and circumstances that could get you removed. Are there any for you, or do you disagree with any that are listed here?
I was just going to say, failure to disclose conflict of interest might be, unless you think it's already included in one of the ones that are listed here. I would say maybe all of them.
And Johnson, in your mind, is that removal or is that just recusal?
No, I'm saying if they fail to disclose a conflict, right, that could be grounds for removal.
So I have two questions. Yeah, this is Janae. Just two questions. Jonathan, when you say failure to disclose a conflict, I was wondering what conflicts you might be thinking of and if those should be defined as to what would be a conflict. And then going back to the earlier discussion we had about criminal conviction and how that's going to be defined in terms of grounds for removal.
Yeah, I'm fine with, if we want to go with the same language on criminal conviction that we've talked about earlier, where it's a consideration or whatnot, but the conflicts I would see that they would need to disclose are, if they have a relationship with any of the parties. That's a clear conflict that they would want to recuse themselves before anything were to come through for them to deliberate on. And if they failed to disclose that and then it was found out later, then that would be the grounds for removal, is what I was trying to say. That's just one potential conflict, but there might be others I'm not foreseeing.
And I was just going to add, whether these individuals are employees or they're volunteers, they will be acting as public officials, which means that the Ohio rules of ethics and disclosure requirements will apply to them. So with that, there are standard understandings of what constitutes a conflict of interest.
Yeah, that I would think too, like some of this could be under the malfeasance category as well. So, I don't know if we need to make anything more explicit beyond that. I'm a little skeptical of like the criminal conviction piece more so. You could have the malfeasance as a thing, but whatever. I think whatever is the normal course of duty that the city utilizes, that folks utilize in removal, I think we should go by. If we need to add some extra pieces there, that's certainly a thing. But this is a very difficult. It's a very subjective. Some of these are very subjective processes that you'd go through, and I don't know if we can get through all those in the next 5 minutes, but I think these generally seem fine to me. I think we should, again, always be on the value of inclusion and trying to make sure that we are being inclusive, but at the same time, we want to make sure that there's a professionalized standard there. So these seem normal to me. Nothing stands out as particularly problematic.
Yeah, I can go. I would agree with Kyle. I was just going to say I would agree. Maybe malfeasance and conflict could be intertwined to some degree. And many times I've seen in the law for public boards, failure to attend meetings is something that they would refer to the appointing authority, but not necessarily grounds for removal. It would be consideration of future appointment. But I would agree any process that they currently have at the city for this sort of thing is probably what needs to be followed. I just don't want to assume that they have a process and that they're looking to us to provide one. Right?
I think that the idea here was if you had any strong feelings about anything new or additional for this list, to let us know. And all of this work obviously is feeding into that first year or so of the board being seated and then going through their own operational, establishing their own operational procedures and norms. So this would be input into that process. But folks would probably want to know what's going to get them removed if they agree to serve. So that's probably the other side of this as well. This last question on this one then was around, and you may just say meet as much as they need to, but any minimum number of meetings that need to be held annually. So what we know is there's probably going to be an initial body of work that's going to take more time, more meetings, more frequently. I would underscore here minimum number. So as a civilian review board, is there any thoughts around the minimum number of times this board would need to sit formally in a given year? Are there any thoughts about that one way or another from this group?
I would probably say 4 kind of being sort of the standard, meeting quarterly, but I think as needed, as you indicated, I think initially, since they're coming up with, bylaws and so many rules initially, it would make sense for them to meet more. But in an official capacity, I would say 4 is a pretty decent number.
I agree.
So minimum 4, obviously, and then meet with the flexibility to meet as needed or as often as needed to execute the appropriate amount of complaints in business is what I'm hearing, I believe. All right. Last question then just deals with the Inspector General. The person or persons charged with effectively leading the investigative functions in many regards. The first question is basically, should the job qualifications be embedded in statute? In other words, should City Council actually pass an ordinance, I guess would be the appropriate word, Lord, tell me if I'm wrong, that would actually say the IG must have these qualifications? That would be the first question. The second one would be, we know the amendment itself indicates that the Inspector General is to be chosen by the board, confirmed by the mayor. Do you look at this as an employee at will that will serve until they don't serve anymore, or should there be a specific term of office for the Inspector General, a 5-year, 7-year, 10-year, whatever that might look like? Any thoughts about both how formally to codify their qualifications and also length of service and at will versus a term employee? Any thoughts on either of those from the work group?
And I just want to give some perspective to why the question's being asked. Like the chief of police and the chief of fire serve 5-year terms that can be renewed. Most employees at the city are either employees at will or they are classified employees because they are in one of the bargaining units. And a number of the director type positions are appointments by the mayor, by the department, sorry. Boards and commissions tend to be specific terms, as we just discussed. So we're just trying to get a sense for where the IG might fall in that general scheme across the city.
In a position like that where you have a specified term, is there a process or grounds for removal of that individual?
Yes. Generally, where you have a specified term, then there are specific grounds, just like we were discussing for the Civilian Review Board. There'll be similar grounds for removing that individual. It'll be like malfeasance, misfeasance. So in other words, it has to be something that rises to a certain level rather than being able to be removed simply because you were dissatisfied with their job performance or they weren't doing what you specifically wanted. There would have to be cause.
Yeah, I think it should be a term, and then of course, if there's cause, then you can remove. But I don't think just an employee at will, because there's going to be some very interesting and probably controversial situations that they'll have to navigate around. So I think it should be a term of office. With that said, there should be a process for removal if for a particular set of wrongdoing.
I would agree with that. I would agree with Kyle on that. I would also offer that on the qualifications embedded in statute. I mean, this person's going to need a lot of investigation experience. And so I know we talked about whether or not somebody with law enforcement experience would be on the board.
But this person should definitely have, law enforcement background and investigative experience in particular.
Okay. But and so are you then saying that, and you think those should be actually in the statute establishing those criteria?
That's what I'm proposing. Although,
okay,
as far as the rest of the qualifications, I think we should leave it up to the board to decide, since they're the ones hiring the person.
I agree with that. I think it should be minimum qualifications that are embedded in the statute.
And as far as a length of term, does it make sense for that to be 5 years, similar to the police and fire chiefs?
I would say so, yes.
So I'm hearing appointed for a term of, at this point, not less than 5 years, still keeping the ability to, terminate for cause. And I'm hearing minimally outlining qualifications for the IG in statute and remaining, keeping some flexibility for the group to be able to establish the job description as a part of the initial onboarding process, hiring and onboarding process. Laura, can we live with that in terms of, do you need more direction beyond that at this point?
I think that's probably all I need to get the ball rolling.
All right. All right.
I guess the one thing that I will kind of maybe push back a little bit on is the idea of a law enforcement background. I appreciate and understand the need for an investigative background, but I don't know that it would necessarily have to be law enforcement.
Plus one to that point. I don't think that should be a requirement.
Well,
I didn't make a note specifically about the qualifications, but just that they needed to be minimally included in the statute, but not what they were.
Well, the only thing I would say about that is, just because somebody's an attorney, for instance, doesn't mean that they have experience investigating or can investigate. The same is true even in law enforcement, right?
Yeah,
the majority of law enforcement officers are on patrol, right?
Yeah, no, I understand that. I just think in terms of the process of inclusion and really opening that up, I think, you can certainly have that qualification, but I don't think we need to make that a requirement as a minimum qualification. I think we might miss out on a lot of different folks who could serve well, who also might not have, there also might be perceived conflicts if you have that as a requirement. So I think, that's something that through the application process and the decision that's made, I think they can make that determination. But I don't think necessarily we should set a mark on that minimum qualification being law enforcement.
Okay, noted. Any other comments generally? I have worked too hard and we had to get to some decisions. So the discussion tonight was just great. So I appreciate all of the energy there and those who stuck around, and we are a few minutes over. But just generally speaking, this is our last formal meeting, but we may be asking to reconvene. I'll yield to Matt for that in just a moment. But any general questions or answers about where we are and next steps? I guess I'll start that by saying our work tonight was to try to get you to some points on some of the bigger picture items that we had not gotten to you to a particular point on. All of this is still recommendation. Our job is to then put that into a format we can present formally to the administration, and then the real work of putting all the details to all of this kind of starts, right? And so there's still a significant amount of work to be done to really get the Civilian Review Board in a place where members can actually serve on it. And so there's a lot of work that will happen over the next several months, but your insight and input into this process has been invaluable. So thank you for all of that thus far. I want to yield to the work group first for any comments or thoughts from you all, and then I'll come to Matt about next steps from the city perspective. Any thoughts from the work group?
Mo, as that proposal is ultimately drafted for adoption, will we see that? And even if we will see that, is anybody interested in any comments we have on that?
I plus one to that. I think I plus one to that real quick. I would say that after this is drafted, I think if they're, just for consideration, to leave the possibility that we get to have some comments on that. Again, I understand these are recommendations and the city is going to make them or not, but I do think that might be a little easier for, especially for folks who maybe didn't make this meeting, but would be interested. I think whether we do a meeting or not, I think having some sort of opportunity for us to provide feedback would be good. But it generally sounds like good next steps.
I don't know if Matt was going to weigh in. Matt?
I was going to, Kate, but I'll certainly defer to you.
Oh, no. Go ahead. I didn't know if you jumped off for the 6 o'clock or not.
No, I'll be late to that.
I'll let you go then.
Oh,
go ahead.
Well, thanks. I just, we wanted to tell all the members, thank you so much for being so generous with your time. We really appreciate all your commitment and your input and your work on this, all the things we have given you to read and consider. I think what we think about our next steps were to Kent and to Kyle's point is, I think that was going to be our question to you, is that to the members, that we were going to start putting the recommendations together. We had such a great discussion and feedback today. I guess I should look right at you. I have two screens, sorry. I'm looking at my bigger screen and talking to it and not looking at anybody, so I apologize. We're going to start working and putting all of the recommendations together based on what we heard from you. And then we wanted to give you another opportunity to look at that. So I think what we wanted to ask was, would you want to get together for another meeting? And maybe we could have the mayor at that meeting and we could discuss those recommendations and then have a final say on them. Or, based on the time you've already given to us, if you wanted us to circulate those to you via email and give you a chance to weigh in on those via email. I'd love to hear what the members think and what your input is on that.
I'll just echo the comments of a couple others. I would like to see them and weigh in on them and potentially have another meeting. I think if we're going to say that these are the recommendations of the work group, I think we've got to see the final product before it goes forward. That's just my thoughts.
Great. Anybody else? Anybody? I see some heads nodding. So how about then if we get, we'll get back to you with a date. I don't think it will be too long. I don't think it'll take us too long to get these recommendations drafted based on your input this evening and the last 5 meetings. So when we get these drafted, how about if we get something out to you and try to get you together again and have these recommendations where we will present them to you.
Perfect. Thank you, guys. Really appreciate it.
All right, folks. Thank you so much again for your participation. More to come, as you well know, but the insight has just been invaluable. So I appreciate it, and on behalf of the city as well, they are so appreciative. And we look forward to being able to thank you all at our final meeting that is to come. So more to come on that. Sorry for the 10 minutes over, but great discussion tonight, and we'll be talking here soon. So enjoy the rest of your week.
Thank you.
Thank you.